remember what EPA stands for, Environmental Protection Agency. They are the entity within the federal government that is supposed to protect the environment. What they did in this rescission is basically say, we no longer are going to protect the atmosphere against these pollutants that basically are causing these profound disruptions that we're seeing. Wildfires, flooding, extreme weather events. They're dismissing all that. They're just flat out claiming it doesn't exist and that therefore they don't have to do it. It's a distortion of reality.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Steve Smith, executive director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, who we heard up top. You may remember him from an episode we did last year, looking at the impacts of the Trump administration's energy policies on southern states. A few of those impacts became even more clear this month, so it seemed like a good time to check in with Steve again. He talked about what he called an Orwellian Ministry of Truth approach to climate policy in the White House. That's coming up. And in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll look at a new exhibit at the International African American Museum in South Carolina, which pays tribute to rural Black Southern arts and crafts. But first, the news roundup. This week, remembering Jesse Jackson's South Carolina roots. Kentucky considers restoring voting rights to some people convicted of felonies. And to start us off, tenure under attack in Tennessee. Tenure for faculty at state universities has long been a source of irritation for Southern conservative lawmakers, for several reasons. It's one of the strongest forms of labor protection available in our right-to-work states, where employees generally have very limited rights on the job and can mostly be fired at will by employers. And it accrues to precisely the kinds of people conservative lawmakers distrust and dislike the most. Highly educated, largely liberal, potentially influential on young people, and often not even from around here. Tenure is sometimes misunderstood as a lifetime job guarantee, which it's not. But once a faculty member earns it, which typically takes 5 to 7 years of employment with positive performance reviews, they generally can't be fired or disciplined without a lengthy due process. That includes a chance to address any issues and for their case to be heard by a panel of faculty peers. The goal is to preserve academic freedom and protect professors from personal or political reprisal. In the last few decades, several states have added new layers of what they call post-tenure review, in which even after tenure is granted, faculty are subject to regular performance reviews by faculty and administrators. Tennessee, for example, enacted post-tenure review for state college and university faculty in 2018. But that's not enough for the state's conservative legislators, especially not after a handful of faculty across the state made critical remarks about Charlie Kirk last September, following the murder of the conservative activist on a college campus in Utah. As we've talked about here on prior episodes, several faculty members were disciplined or fired for personal social media posts about Kirk, and have subsequently filed lawsuits on First Amendment free speech grounds. In Tennessee, one of those faculty members, Darren Michael, a theater and dance professor at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, was recently reinstated by the school and also given a $500,000 settlement. Needless to say, that didn't sit well with Republicans in the General Assembly. Last week, the House Higher Education Subcommittee heard 2 different bills that aimed to limit faculty members' protections for their actions in or out of the classroom. Both, as it happens, came from Republican legislators in the Knoxville metro area, my own backyard. The most extreme of the 2 was sponsored by State Representative Justin Lafferty, who proposed to eliminate tenure entirely. It would prohibit any public college or university from awarding tenure to anyone after July 1st of this year. Faculty who already had tenure could retain it, but the bill would make it much easier for university leaders to discipline or dismiss them. There was a lot of pushback against that bill from university administrators across the state, who said it would make it hard for them to recruit talented faculty. Lafferty ultimately took the bill off notice, meaning it won't move forward unless he puts it back on the calendar. But before he did that, he offered a rationale for the bill that included a fairly convoluted history of the idea of tenure. He suggested that it was more necessary when there were fewer qualified people with college degrees for universities to hire.
We've got a lot of college graduates walking around these days. We've got a lot of people with a lot of very high degrees these days. It is a very different world than it was even when my dad graduated. A college degree in the 1960s and 1970s guaranteed you a high-paying job. Many of you on this committee know that we've got a lot of degrees these days that, unfortunately, you come out with about the same amount of debt as you're going to make the first year that you go to work. So I say all of that to get back to the pendulum. We went back several hundred years to a time where there weren't very many educated people, and it was very important to keep the best and the brightest around so that they didn't go. And I'm not saying that today it's not important to keep the best and the brightest. I am, however, saying there are a lot more people available these days that can fill those roles. That is what started me. That's what's brought me to this point. We have hit a point now where saturation's not the right word. We have lots of opportunities. The pool is a lot larger today than it was in the 1960s. And we've got to a point with tenure now, the pendulum has swung so far that we can have state employees that we pay with our tax dollars. Mock might not be the right word, but can certainly be very insensitive towards the death of another human being. And as a Tennessean, I'm not comfortable with the fact that that person cannot be removed from a job.
But a separate bill sponsored by State Representative Jason Zachary did move forward with the support of all of the Republicans on the subcommittee. Zachary went out of his way to say that he understands the importance of the tenure process in protecting academic freedom, and on paper at least his bill would leave it intact. But it also separates out disciplinary action for misconduct from tenure per se and strips away several layers of protection, including the right to be heard by a panel of faculty peers. It makes tenured faculty subject to the same lower standards of job protection as non-tenured faculty and staff. It directs university officials to create new disciplinary policies with teeth for any employees found to violate a school's codes of conduct, although it leaves it up to the schools to set those codes and policies. But it says that administrators, by law, are not bound by tenure considerations in disciplining or firing faculty. Zachary expressed disdain for the current protections afforded by tenure.
So right now, the process for tenure, the process for accountability is rather cumbersome. There's multiple sections of code that require the board to take certain steps. There's multiple sections of code that require the university academic officers, the chancellors, the presidents to take numerous steps. There's numerous people involved. It's a process that in the academic world, it is unlike anywhere else, both public and private, regarding accountability for employees. And so what we do is, again, we streamline, again, to use that word, we streamline by empowering the boards of each institutions to create a set of policies that is clear to follow related to discipline, and then we remove some of those cumbersome steps to allow accountability. We preserve due process, and we make that clear within the legislation, but we remove some of those cumbersome, I believe it's 6 steps that is required within the university before any discipline can be applied to an employee. And then there's also certain steps the boards have to take. And when you get that many people involved, it's almost impossible to hold anyone accountable for any inappropriate behavior or conduct.
The sole no vote on the bill came from the only Democrat on the subcommittee, State Representative Ronnie Glynn of Clarksville. He grilled and lectured Zachary about what he said were the bill's true motives, to intimidate state employees by threatening to punish them for their speech.
The line between freedom of speech and I don't like what you said has been blurred. And it's been blurred to the point to where when someone makes a comment, and because I'm in a position of power, I can now use that power to silence you. And that is wrong. Because if we truly believe in the Constitution, then we should be open for comment. We should be open for things that we may not disagree with. Because everyone is not going to agree in everything. That's just the way we are. And as I understand it, that's why the First Amendment is here, so that we can distinguish between what we agree and what we don't agree without it becoming, you're going to lose your job. I'm going to silence you. And I really believe that's what this is about.
Zachary's bill next moves to the full House Education Committee. It looks to have substantial Republican support. Meanwhile, Lafferty said his bill to eliminate tenure completely could still come back. It appears that the two are playing kind of a bad cop, worse cop routine, with Zachary merely kneecapping tenure protections, but leaving the system more or less intact, while Lafferty holds the nuclear option in reserve. North of Nashville, up in Frankfort, the Kentucky General Assembly is considering a bill that would provide at least some convicted felons who have served their sentences with a path to restoring their voting rights. States vary widely in how they restrict voting rights for people convicted of felonies. In Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia, they never lose their rights and can vote even while incarcerated. 23 other states strip voting rights while people are in prison, but they are automatically restored along with their other rights on release. In the other half of the country, including all of the southern states, voting rights are lost for the duration of a sentence, including any post-release parole or probation. And in 10 of those, including Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Virginia, people must take additional steps to regain their right to vote even after completing their full sentences. Kentucky had long been one of the most severe in not allowing people to regain suffrage until 2019, when Governor Andy Beshear issued an executive order granting automatic restoration of rights to those not convicted of violent offenses, treason, or election-related crimes. The rights are restored only after the end of any parole or probation. Now the legislature is looking to essentially codify Beshear's executive order, a timely effort given that Beshear is term-limited and leaving office at the end of 2027, and a future governor could rescind the order. A bill following most of the contours of Beshear's order has bipartisan sponsorship, and it passed out of the Kentucky Senate's State and Local Government Committee last week. Voting rights advocates say it doesn't go far enough. The Sentencing Project, a national nonprofit that advocates for criminal justice reform, noted that even with Beshear's order, there are still more than 152,000 Kentuckians who can't vote, either because of the nature of their crimes or because they are on parole or probation. That amounts to 4% of the state's voting population, 1 out of every 25 potential voters. And the numbers, like incarceration rates overall, are racially skewed. Although African Americans make up only 9% of Kentucky's population, they are 21% of the prison population and 18% of people on parole or probation. State Senator Keturah Herron, the Democratic sponsor of the bill, told critics that it was a step in the right direction. "This is a bill that I think we can get passed here out of the Senate, and we will do what we need to do after it moves through the process," she said, according to the Kentucky Lantern. The Reverend Jesse Jackson died last week at the age of 84. The civil rights leader and two-time presidential candidate died in Chicago, where he spent much of his adult life leading social justice organizations. But like the civil rights movement itself, Jackson was a product of the South. He was born in Greenville, South Carolina in 1941, and grew up under Jim Crow laws, attending segregated schools. He initially enrolled at the University of Illinois on a football scholarship, but soon transferred to North Carolina A&T, a historically black school in Greensboro. He was charismatic from a young age and was quarterback of his high school football team and elected student body president at both high school and college. Like many young black people across the South in that era, he was energized by the civil rights movement. While home in Greenville on a college break in 1960, Jackson was one of 8 black students who staged a silent sit-in at the city's main public library, which was open only to white people. The sit-in was Jackson's idea. The previous year, he had needed a particular book for a college project, and it wasn't available at the library open to black residents, but it was at the white library. He organized the protest with support from a local NAACP leader. The students entered the library and picked out books or magazines and sat at tables to read. Police arrived, called by the librarians, and arrested the students. They were in jail for only 15 minutes or so before being bailed out. Jackson's activism eventually put him in the orbit of the Reverend Martin Luther King, who was impressed by the younger man's dedication and organizing skills. In 1965, Jackson was part of the Selma to Montgomery marches for voting rights, and soon after, King sent him to Chicago to organize a Southern Christian Leadership Council office there. The move turned out to be permanent for Jackson, who embedded himself in the culture and politics of his new city. But he remained active in the South. He was in Memphis in April 1968 with King and other SCLC leaders when King was assassinated. He was familiar to and with many Southern journalists who interacted with him over the decades. In a nice reminiscence in the South Carolina Daily Gazette, political reporter Paul Hyde recounts the experience of seeing and hearing Jackson speak to crowds. Hyde writes, quote, "Jackson gave us the soaring music of the American dream, without which politics can seem like a dull and sometimes shabby business. A speech by Jackson was like a Baptist sermon or a Tchaikovsky symphony, beginning softly, slowly, earthbound with mundane detail. But that was just stage setting for the virtuosic performance to follow. His voice would swell, rising in volume and intensity until the final coda rang out in call-and-response affirmation. These are our children. I am somebody. And, of course, keep hope alive." Unquote. Jackson was viewed as a long-shot candidate when he ran for the Democratic Party nomination in both 1984 and 1988. But he made more of an impact than a lot of people expected both times. In 1988, he won primaries and caucuses in 11 states and finished second to nominee Michael Dukakis. The experience gave Jackson insight into how party leaders used the primary system to benefit their preferred candidates, and he successfully pushed for changes in how delegates are awarded, proportionate to a candidate's share of a state's vote. Previously, some states were winner-take-all, with runners-up getting no delegates. The revamped system that Jackson helped create was used successfully by another candidate from Chicago 20 years later, when Barack Obama racked up delegates across the board and defeated presumed favorite Hillary Clinton. Jackson was at the election night party in Hyde Park when Obama was declared the winner in 2008, and a widely reproduced photo showed him weeping as the news came in. Barack and Michelle Obama were among the many who lauded Jackson last week, saying in a statement that, quote, "we stood on his shoulders." You might remember that Texas populist writer and politician Jim Hightower talked about his own work with Jackson when we chatted with him last fall. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
And I mean, just the best speaker I've ever heard or involved, and the most able to connect with people of all times. And I worked with him, for example, with farmers. He ran thus far still the only intentionally racially inclusive populist campaign in recent American history within the Democratic Party. He intentionally reached out to Tony Anaya, the governor of New Mexico, because he wanted that, and Little Joe Hernandez, a fabulous and well-known musician in Latino communities. He reached out to me because he wanted somebody with a cowboy hat and a white face to say this is legitimate. And he had a rally that I was part of in northwest Wisconsin, where 2,000 farmers had it, all white farmers, come to hear this man's message because he had a message. In fact, when I endorsed Jackson that year for president, there were only two white office holders in America who endorsed Jackson for president in the primary, me and Bernie Sanders. Bernie was mayor of Burlington, Vermont at the time. And I called my father the night before I did the endorsement, which was at the state capitol, the state senate building, ornate building with Confederate soldier pictures around it. Quite a scene. Anyway, I called my father because I didn't want him to, he's got friends who are not left-wing supporters. And I said, well, I'm going to endorse Jesse Jackson. And he said, well, he's the only one making any sense. So I thought, hallelujah, we might have something here.
Still, as the New York Times noted last week, there is little in Jackson's hometown to acknowledge him. No streets or buildings or monuments in Greenville bear his name. Maybe the renewed attention brought by his death will change that. Okay, now we're to my conversation with Steve Smith of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And yes, this is the second week in a row we're talking about environmental issues in the South, after last week's interview with Jeff Gisler of the Southern Environmental Law Center. Sometimes that's just the way the news breaks. Unfortunately, human pollution and climate change are probably going to remain recurrent stories in our region for a long time to come. The Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is a nonprofit organization based right here in Knoxville, Tennessee. It works with power companies and governments throughout the Southeast to advocate for reduced carbon emissions and increased clean energy production. I talked to Steve on the podcast last fall about power companies and energy usage across the South and the effects of the Trump administration's aggressive moves to double down on fossil fuels. Those moves became even more clear and urgent earlier this month on back-to-back days. On February 11th, the board of directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which supplies power to about 9 million people across parts of 7 southern states, voted to reverse a long-standing plan to close 2 large coal-fired power plants. The next day, Trump's Environmental Protection Agency reversed a 2009 finding that greenhouse gases are a hazard to human health, essentially abandoning the federal government's right to regulate them. So that seemed like a good time to check back in with Steve to understand the implications and impacts of those decisions. One note, this interview is a bit of a joint production. We also used it in the other podcast I'm part of, Compass Points, which covers news in the Knoxville area. If you happen to be interested in East Tennessee news, you can find it linked in the show notes. But that's why you'll hear me mention Compass at one point. With that said, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, and we are joined this week by Steve Smith, Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, to talk about some major and maybe a little bit alarming news that happened this week, both locally and nationally. Steve, thanks a lot for jumping on here. And to start off, maybe can you just quickly tell us about the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy for people who are not familiar?
Great. Thanks, Jess. So the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is a regional, both energy policy and environmental advocacy organization that does work throughout the Southeast United States. So primary states are Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. We do a lot of interventions and regulatory proceedings at the state level because in many of these jurisdictions, you have monopoly utilities that are required to have oversight by state regulators. And so we engage in a lot of the regulatory dockets, things like integrated resource planning, rate cases, and other things with large investor-owned utilities. The Southeast has some of the largest energy companies in the world. Think about it like Duke Energy, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Southern Company, NextEra, Florida Power and Light. These are very large entities, and they're typically vertically integrated, whereas they're not in competitive markets like we have in other parts of the country. So the regulatory regime is kind of unique. And then with something like TVA, it's kind of completely a unicorn the way they're structured because they're federal. And so therefore, it requires a lot of adaptability to go in and work. But utilities primarily, and then we do a lot of work in electric transportation and energy efficiency. And the primary goal is to reduce the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy in the region.
All right. Well, speaking of that unicorn, TVA, the TVA Board of Directors met this past week for the first time with its full complement of new Trump appointees. They haven't even had a quorum for the last year, and so weren't able to meet and take any action. And the action they took this past week reflected some changed priorities as a result of that changed administration and the new people who are on the board. So the most, I guess, attention grabbing, and we wrote about this at Compass, but the thing that they did that really sent, I think, a pretty clear message about where they're coming from and going to is they reversed a decision to shut down 2 coal-fired power plants. And so I guess my questions for you are, first of all, were you surprised by that, or had that been telegraphed to some degree? And, what does that actually signify to you?
Honestly, I'm not surprised by anything TVA is doing these days, because they are so kind of untethered from reality that it is it's problematic. And you may have seen the piece that I did in response to this, where I sort of talk about the ministry of truth in the Orwellian sense out of the 1984 novel has dictated through Truth Social and Truth tweets that, this shall be the order of reality and we are all to comply with it. That's kind of the world we're in right now. And so it's not grounded in good empirical science, nor is it grounded in good economics. Just to give your listeners a little bit of context, when the Trump administration was elected, they within a few months of being in, Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, began to orchestrate a move to try to mold TVA's decision-making into things that she liked and the Trump administration liked. So there was this big push on, nuclear reactors, small modular reactors in Oak Ridge, even though they're not sort of, again, grounded in good economics. And then there was also this desire to pull away from, not that TVA had an aggressive renewable program, but even more so pull away from renewables and try to reinstate some coal plants that were over a multi-year planning process that were set to retire, one being the Cumberland, which is TVA's largest coal-fired power plant outside of Clarksville, Tennessee, and the second being the notorious Kingston plant, which is in East Tennessee near Harriman, just west of Oak Ridge. And these are Kingston in particular predates Elvis's first album, came to power when Dwight Eisenhower was president. It is a 1954 vintage coal plant that is not very efficient. It's large, not as large as Cumberland, but it's large. But it is most notorious for the Kingston coal ash spill, which is the largest industrial accident in the history of the United States on land. You can also, in another fossil fuel issue, you can look at the Deepwater Horizon as being the largest one at sea. But the Southeast, in 2008, we had the Kingston coal ash spill. In 2010, we had the Deepwater Horizon. That shows you we've been heavily impacted by, fossil fuels. No one was killed that night in December in 2008, but 50 plus people have died in the cleanup, and it's been very devastating to the community. And it was a phenomenal amount of coal ash, toxic coal ash, spilled out on that late December evening. The reason I emphasize that is, you ask, how did this sort of come into being? It was that event that opened the door for us for the first time for TVA to really start having a serious conversation about retiring these old coal assets. And so I was invited to testify before the Environment and Public Works Committee shortly after that happened in early January 2009. And we got TVA to re-engage the integrated resource planning process. We got them to begin, which is their long-range planning, to start talking about, if you deal with coal ash, you deal with the air pollution, you deal with all the scrubbers and SCR, selected catalytic reduction units, you have to deal with air pollution. If you deal with all those things, it raises the cost of coal to make it uneconomic. And TVA was blinded, and they weren't willing to confront those things until after the Kingston coal ash spill. They really began to deal with it. And so from basically 2011 until 2024, TVA systematically started to retire their aging coal fleet, unfortunately replace it primarily with methane gas units, but also do some renewables and some other things. What happened on Wednesday of this week is a complete reversal of that, because you can track a very clean line from the Kingston coal ash spill. We asked them to do an integrated resource plan. They did it in 2011. And from 2011 through Wednesday, there was a clear track that TVA recognized that for both environmental and economic reasons and lowering risk overall, they should retire their old coal units. And again, these things are 70 years plus years old. And so they had 11 coal units. They're down to 4. The 2 that were sort of resurrected, at least temporarily, on Wednesday. One is their largest, Cumberland, and then one is their oldest, Kingston. There's 2 others. There's one at Gallatin, right outside of Nashville, and one up in western Kentucky at Shawnee that were slated to retire later. Those were not talked about much at the board meeting. They focused mainly on stopping and reversing these 2. Does this decision make economic sense? Absolutely not. Is there a rationale for needing to do this? Because, as they said, because of digital demand and other things, load growth, that they're needed? We doubt that. But because of the dysfunction that Trump did last year by taking the board into a non-quorum situation, there was an integrated resource plan that was in the works that was never fully ratified by the board because the board was in a non-quorum state. In that draft environmental impact statement, in the environmental impact statement related to the draft, but in the actual integrated resource plan, TVA did not at that time need these plants. And that is why they were able to retire them. It wasn't going to cause a problem with load. We do not know that there's anything substantial that has happened between that last public analysis and now that has changed, other than the Ministry of Truth dictating down to them that they should all of a sudden embrace clean, beautiful coal and prop it up even though it's not needed and it's not economic. There's no empirical evidence that it's needed. And you can think about that. TVA is experiencing load growth, but they have a number of methane gas plants, and they were even doing some solar and some other things that are in the works that were able to cover that projected load growth. And there's nothing that's visible that has changed other than the Ministry of Truth dictate.
And so, what does this mean functionally? Were those plants already in some process of having their output reduced, that they're now going to fire back up? Or does this just mean that they'll keep operating as they are for however long until maybe there's a subsequent change in policy down the road?
That is a very good question. Because the board is not transparent and because the economics to this decision are not transparent, no one knows for sure. Interestingly, the board delegated to the CFO, Rice, the ability to make that decision, which to me indicates that at least internally to TVA, they know that this doesn't make economic sense, and so they want to give their CFO some flexibility in carrying it out. But the theatrics of it, to correspond to what was going on in the White House almost simultaneously with the sort of coal revival that Trump was happening in the East Room, these things were orchestrated together. But if you think about it and you look at the performance in the 85, 90 plus years that TVA has been in existence, to their credit, they haven't had rolling blackouts except for once. And that happened during Winter Storm Elliott. And what triggered that in a very profound way was the fact that the Cumberland plant went down in the middle of the winter storm, and it precipitated the things. When we had this most recent bout of weather, Fern, these are like wayward children. We've got all these names for all these winter storms now, but Fern, basically Cumberland dropped down again and was offline. So the reliability of these things is in question. And part of that is not unexpected. If you're going to retire those units, you are not doing the upkeep and maintenance because it costs a ton of money. These things are not cheap to operate. And so are we now going to see them have to spend money for both the methane plants and now going back and trying to prop up these coal plants because the Ministry of Truth directive that you have to do this, even though it's not grounded in any empirical reality? I mean, that I don't know. We don't know that yet. So it's a huge outstanding question. And I don't believe that there's any rational reason that they will keep these plants going from an economic or obviously not an environmental point of view, because these plants are, Cumberland's one of the biggest polluters in the country, based primarily on its size, but also just the fact that it's, a coal-fired power plant. So, and their heat rates, which is a measure of their efficiency, are all pretty low. They're going to be much lower compared to these new methane gas plants, which they're continuing. They've got the pipeline infrastructure, and they're actually in the construction phase at Cumberland. So it makes no sense. But outside of the theatrics and the politics. And so the other key term that I've used to describe the moment we're in with TVA is I have never seen them so politically captured. Capture is a term of art, and they are captured by the administration. Normally, and we saw it with the first Trump administration, TVA pushed back when Trump was telling them to slow things down. They continued to retire their plants, because that was in that window I was telling you from 2011 till Wednesday. Even in the Biden administration, as much as we wanted TVA to move quicker on some of the renewables and everything, they pushed back even on Biden. They are undeniably fully captured, unapologetically. And when you hear their CFO thanking the Energy Dominance Council and talking about, I've never heard a executive at TVA talk about coal as big, beautiful coal. Mm-hmm. That is the extent of the capture that the moment we're in.
Well, and so speaking of capture, to turn our attention to the national level, although, of course, climate change is both local and national because it's everywhere all the time. The Trump EPA, obviously, the day right after TVA made this decision with the coal plants, the Trump EPA released their long anticipated reversal of the endangerment finding that I guess dates back to the Obama administration that first established that the federal government had authority and jurisdiction to regulate carbon emissions on the grounds that they posed hazards to human health. That, of course, was challenged, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court that, yes, the federal government does have this authority. So now EPA has come back and just basically said, never mind, right? So, I mean, I know that this was anticipated, but just your reactions to that, and what does that mean for us here? What does it mean for TVA? What does it mean for our power producers?
Well, this is very, very serious. I think the term of art that EPA used was they had rescinded the endangerment finding. I am not well versed in all the granularity of all the legal challenges because this is going to be challenged legally, and there is good evidence that the scientific rationale that the EPA is using for justifying this rescission or pulling back from their commitment to basically regulate greenhouse gases is not strong in the current administration, which is not surprising because they're largely anti-science and they tend to dictate stuff as opposed to actually verify it. But let's go back conceptually here for a second and just really realize the moment we're in. There is a very strong scientific consensus that we are pushing our home planet, the only planet we have, or the only home we have, and into areas of instability that we have never experienced before in all of recorded human history. We sort of take for granted that the climate on the planet Earth is stable, and since the Holocene, the last 12,000 years or so, it has been, and that's what has allowed agriculture and human flourishing to happen, and all these things. we are moving the planet into levels of instability that have not been documented on this planet for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. We have got to address this, and the fact that this administration continues to call climate change a hoax, a scam, a con job, and does not bring any empirical science to the table on that is extraordinarily problematic. EPA is let's remember what EPA stands for, Environmental Protection Agency. They are the entity within the federal government that is supposed to protect the environment. What they did in this rescission is basically say, we no longer are going to protect the atmosphere against these pollutants that basically are causing these profound disruptions that we're seeing. Wildfires, flooding, extreme weather events, the droughts. I mean, I could go on and on about how our lived experience is seeing these things manifest, and the science behind it is sort of like gravity. It's very basic of what's going on. They're dismissing all that. They're just flat out claiming it doesn't exist and that therefore they don't have to do it. It's a distortion of reality. And so again, gets back to this sort of dystopian 1984, we shall dictate what reality is, even though it doesn't line up for what our lived experience is. That's the moment we're in. It's profound. I think that where it manifests most directly is that the utilities had started moving already into a zone of reducing their carbon emissions. And because they have this long runway, they have to make multi-billion-dollar decisions for plants that take 5 years or more to build, cost billions of dollars, and then have a tail of 40 plus years or so. I don't know that this is going to cause a lot of change because there's so much risk. And I think most of the folks in the utility industry had come to terms with the fact that carbon is an issue that they have to deal with. Where I think it's going to have the most impact is in the transportation sector with automobiles, because I think that we hadn't fully got the automobile industry to make that shift. We're in the middle of a transition from internal combustion engines to hybrids to full battery electric, which is where we ultimately need to go. And I think this is going to further complexify that. And I think that it's going to be tricky to see kind of how tailpipe standards and other things, which ultimately were leading to more efficient vehicles, which save people money, and ultimately leading to the United States staying competitive in the world market with their automobile manufacturers in the form of going to electric and hybrid cars. Zeldin, the EPA administrator, and Trump seem to be very aggressively trying to say that we don't need to go electric. Somehow or another, we're going to double down on petroleum and fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, whereas the rest of the world is rapidly moving away from it. And so, this American isolationism, I think, is going to have a devastating effect for the U.S. automobile industry, because we're sending them all the wrong signals to make the transition, and we're pretending that this climate reality that we're dealing with is not happening. So I think it's going to have effect on the utilities to some degree, but I think it's going to have much more effect on the automobile industry. TVA is a unique example because TVA is federal, and the board of TVA is appointed by the Trump administration. Therefore, they are particularly receptive to the Ministry of Truth dictates, like we saw. And so that's why I think TVA is such a stark example of this sort of reversal. I think a lot of the other utilities are probably scratching their head a little bit and trying to figure out, what are we going to do? But I think the automobile industry is where this is really going to be problematic.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Steve. Always good to talk. And I know it's been quite a week, so I apprate your time.
Quite a week. Well, and look, I really appreciate y'all staying on top of these issues and making sure, they're aware, because there's so much distraction out there. You've got to separate the signal from the noise about what's really happening. And so, I'm glad that you guys are focused on the signal and not just the noise.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for helping us.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Jess. Thanks a lot.
The International African American Museum opened in Charleston, South Carolina in 2023. It's located along Gadsden's Wharf, where an estimated 100,000 enslaved Africans disembarked during the transatlantic slave trade. As we close out Black History Month, I wanted to mention an exhibition that opened at the museum on February 7th. Titled Middle of Somewhere, The Art and Legacy of Black Southern Makers, it highlights the arts and crafts of centuries of African American life in the South. It includes displays of quotidian household goods like quilts, sweetgrass baskets, ceramics, ironwork, and handmade furniture. Among the makers celebrated are people like David Drake, also known as Dave the Potter, who lived in Edgefield, South Carolina in the 1800s. He made large ceramic stoneware vessels inscribed with poetic verses. You can also find the work of artisan and blacksmith Philip Simmons, born on Daniel Island, South Carolina, in 1912. He became one of the most in-demand ironworkers in Charleston, creating elaborate balconies, window grills, gates, and fences for homes and buildings across the city. There's also work by contemporary artists like Danielle Williams of Strong Roots Pottery, who makes what she calls Bantu knot vases, festooned with coils and cross-hatching that resemble the traditional Zulu hairstyle. The overarching argument of the exhibition is that the creative work of generations of Black Southern makers needs to be understood as not only the practical wares of daily life, but a deeper expression of inspiration, resilience, and community. As curator Martina Morale puts it, this exhibition offers a timely reconsideration of Southern art history through the visionary lens of Black creativity. By moving beyond the idea of craft as a relic of the past, we center the maker, the hand, and the generational knowledge that has shaped the very fabric of American material culture. The exhibition runs through February 14th, 2027, so you have plenty of time to catch it if you're in or around Charleston. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.